There is a kind of pain that settles silently inside a person long before they admit its existence. A pain that arrives not in storms, but with a slow drip that corrodes the days from within. And you feel it not as a scream, but as a weight on your chest, an unspoken truth that you have carried for years without ever daring to name it, because naming it would make it real, and making it real would force you to face the places where your life, or at least part of it, began to silently unravel. It's the kind of pain that arises in the most mundane moments, when you open a drawer and forget why you opened it, or when you sit on the edge of the bed and realize that the morning no longer brings expectations, only repetition and a slight weariness that seems to have taken root under your skin, and you look around the house, the same house that once vibrated with voices, footsteps, and laughter, and notice how the walls now echo emptiness in a way they never did before, not because something terrible has happened, but because everything has simply passed. This pain is subtle, yet relentless. It's the feeling that the world has moved on a train that you somehow missed, leaving you stranded on a platform that grows colder with each passing year. And nobody warned you this would happen. Nobody prepared you for the moment in life when you would feel like you were watching your own story from the outside, unable to return to the chapter where things still seemed vibrant and full of possibilities. And so you go through your days with this silent pain carefully hidden beneath your routine, pretending it's normal, pretending everyone feels the same way, pretending it doesn't matter as much as it does. Sometimes it arises at unexpected moments, like when you see your reflection in a window and for a fraction of a second, you don't recognize the person looking back, not because their features have changed, but because their eyes have grown tired of pretending they're okay. Or when someone calls your name and you hear a slight tremor in your own voice, a subtle break that you hope no one else notices, and you tell yourself it's just age, stress, or the natural progression of a life lived long, enough to accumulate disappointments. But you know deep down it's more than that. It's the pain of becoming someone you never imagined you'd become. And this truth hurts, because it forces you to confront the secret corners of your life where choices were avoided, where love was denied, where forgiveness never arrived, where dreams were postponed until they dissipated like mist, and you tell yourself that everyone carries regrets. But yours seem engraved on your ribs, as if they were waiting to be acknowledged after decades of silence, and you wonder how many others walk around with this same invisible wound, the one that doesn't bleed, but never fully heals. The strangest thing is how the pain remains hidden even from those closest to you. It disguises itself behind small smiles, quiet routines, polite conversations, and the practiced art of saying everything is fine when you know it's not. You become an expert at measuring your words with such precision that no one ever suspects you're falling apart inside. And there's something profoundly lonely about suffering in a way that's invisible even to those you love, because it makes you believe that no one would understand, even if you tried to explain. You might notice this when you wake up in the middle of the night, for no apparent reason, and the darkness seems heavier than usual, not frightening, but dense, as if it holds everything you never said and never dared to feel. And you stare at the ceiling, wondering how a life can seem so familiar and, at the same time, so distant, as if at some point you lost yourself without realizing the separation. There is also a specific memory that sometimes returns, a moment from years ago, trivial yet persistent, perhaps a conversation you avoided, a hurried goodbye, an opportunity you let slip away. And this memory becomes a metaphor for everything you postponed, everything you told yourself you would deal with later, until later became never, and never became the silent shadow that now accompanies you through the days. This pain is not a punishment nor a failure. It is a sign, a whisper from the depths of your being, saying that something essential needs to be faced, something that has been patiently waiting for your attention, because ignoring it has only allowed it to deepen and become heavier, pressing on your chest in recent hours, reminding you that you cannot run away from what you refuse to acknowledge. And if you're feeling this now, if these words are finding you in a place you haven't allowed anyone else to enter, know that you're not alone. Many who reach this stage of life carry a similar weight, a silent pain born from decades of living, loving, losing, trying, failing, starting over, and enduring more than most would ever imagine simply by looking at you. And it takes courage to admit that the pain you tried to bury has surfaced, asking not for solutions, but for recognition. If this touched you in any way, share it in the comments. Your experience might help someone who is watching in silence. And if you feel that this voice speaks to a part of you that no one else can reach, subscribe to the channel so we can continue walking together through these truths. There is a silence that doesn't arrive suddenly. It begins softly, almost delicately, infiltrating the recesses of your life without announcing itself. At first, you don't notice anything unusual because silence is rarely accompanied by noise. It grows like dust, accumulating in places you no longer pay attention to. And one day, you find yourself wondering when exactly the house became so silent, or when the rooms began to carry that strange echo that only appears when things remain silent for too long. This silence begins in the routine, long before it becomes a feeling. You wake up and walk through the same spaces, the same hallway, the same kitchen, the same chair at the table, but something subtle has changed. Your movements are the same, yet the air around you no longer responds with the familiar warmth of presence. It feels like an invisible curtain separating you from the world you once inhabited with such certainty, as if your footsteps were being absorbed by something deeper, something that no longer returns the sound in the same way as before. You realize this when you open the door after returning from somewhere, and instead of being greeted by voices, footsteps, or even the small noises of life, you are greeted by a stillness that seems almost watchful. And for a moment, you simply stand there, keys still in hand, wondering how a place that once held so many layers of your history can now seem to belong to someone else, someone who has already left. There are nights when silence settles on your shoulders like a gentle weight, and you sit in the living room with the television off, not because you desired silence, but because you forgot to turn something on. And when you finally notice the absence of sound, you also notice the absence of yourself, or at least the version of you that once moved confidently through daily life. Without that persistent feeling of fading, a feeling that whispers that you are no longer as visible to the world as before. This also happens when you look in the mirror, not seeking beauty or youth, but simply trying to recognize the person reflected there, and the reflection looks back with an expression that seems distant, not unhappy, but indifferent, like someone waiting for you to pay attention again. You approach, as if proximity could restore familiarity, but the eyes that stare back at you carry a depth that you don't immediately understand, a depth sculpted not by age, but by the stillness that time accumulates within the soul. The silence becomes more noticeable when you speak aloud after hours without saying a single word, and your own voice sounds a little strange, as if it belonged to someone who had lived underwater for a long time. You wonder when speaking ceased to be a natural part of your day, when words became optional and silence became the default atmosphere, keeping everything in balance. Sometimes, this silence manifests itself in small and surprising ways, like when you pick up your phone and realize that no one has called for days, or when you scroll through old messages and see conversations slowly fading away until they disappear into long, empty spaces, and you remember how easy it used to be to connect, how simple it was to answer the phone without thinking, and now you hesitate because you fear that getting in touch might reveal how long you've been silently out of sight. There's a moment many people experience, but rarely admit to. The moment you realize you've become the backdrop to your own life, the observer instead of the participant, watching neighbors come and go, seeing families grow, seeing the seasons change around you, while your inner world remains strangely paused, waiting for something you can't name. And in that waiting, the silence deepens, not as an enemy, but as a reminder that something within you has been neglected for too long. On some nights, this silence feels almost alive, as if it breathes around you, moving with the shadows on the walls, and it makes you question whether loneliness is a choice, a circumstance, or perhaps a slow accumulation of days when no one really saw you. And you wonder how many others feel this same silent erosion, but are too proud or too afraid to admit it, even to themselves. What's most striking is that silence doesn't necessarily mean emptiness. Sometimes it means you've stopped pretending, stopped running, stopped filling your inner spaces with noise and distractions, and now you're face to face with yourself, with the version of yourself that existed beneath all the roles and expectations. And once you perceive that presence, there's no way to ignore it, because it's real, more real than any noise ever was. And this realization awakens a strange kind of longing, a longing not for people or places, but for the feeling of being fully alive within one's own life again. the longing to hear footsteps in the hallway, even if they are your own, the longing to feel that your presence still has weight in the world, that you haven't disappeared, even if the world sometimes doesn't perceive your existence. And this longing becomes a silent invitation, gently propelling you towards something deeper within your own story. If this silence resonates with you, if it reflects something you felt in the quiet corners of your daily life, share a bit of your experience in the comments. Your voice might be the one that brings comfort to someone who needs to hear that they're not withering away alone. And if these reflections speak to your soul in a way that feels rare or genuine, consider subscribing. It helps me continue creating these honest spaces where we can breathe together without pretending anything. Simone Weil understood suffering in a way that very few people dare to achieve. She didn't see it as something to be avoided at all costs, nor as something to be glorified or romanticized. She believed that suffering had a strange power to unveil the layers of illusion that most of us spend our entire lives building around ourselves. And even if we resist this truth, there comes a moment when pain confronts us with a clarity for which we were never prepared. A clarity that doesn't ask permission and doesn't wait for the right moment, because pain rarely knocks on the door. It simply enters and begins its silent work. Will used to say that attention is the purest form of prayer, but what most people never hear is how she believed that suffering forces attention more intensely than anything else. When life is comfortable, the mind wanders, drifts, gets distracted by noise and routine. But when suffering arrives, everything narrows, the senses sharpen, the world becomes painfully precise, and suddenly, things that once seemed irrelevant become unbearably important, like the trembling of hands when trying to hold a cup, or the heavier breathing when memories press on the chest without warning. She herself experienced this in ways most people wouldn't imagine. Her frail body often on the verge of collapse, her days filled with physical limitations and emotional exhaustion. Even so, instead of shying away, she embraced this vulnerability, not to seek out the pain, but to understand what it revealed. She believed that suffering strips away everything false, all the masks, all the performances, all the excuses, until a person comes face to face with the truth of who they are, unadorned, defenseless. And this raw encounter can be like standing before a mirror that finally refuses to lie. There's a moment that many people rarely talk about, the moment when pain breaks through the last layer of denial and the world suddenly seems too loud, too sharp, too real. You may have felt this after a loss, a betrayal, an unexpected rupture in your life. And in that moment, the world didn't shrink. It expanded in a way that overwhelmed you, because suffering doesn't diminish life. It reveals its full weight. And that weight can seem almost sacred, even if it terrifies you. Weil believed that affliction, which she described as a deeper form of suffering than ordinary pain, has the uncanny ability to dissolve the ego, not by crushing it, but by exposing its fragility. She said that true suffering is where the soul confronts the limits of its own control and realizes that strength is not found in victory, but in surrender, not in triumph, but in paying attention to what hurts, without looking away. And this idea seems almost unbearable because most of us have spent our lives training ourselves to avoid precisely what demands our attention. Think about the moments that shaped you the most. They were rarely the easy ones, rarely the celebrations, the victories, the comfortable days. The moments that profoundly transformed you were those in which you were forced to be alone with yourself, without distractions. Perhaps it was the night you cried softly so no one would hear, or the day a truth you feared finally came to light, or the morning you woke up in a world that no longer made sense and realized you needed to rebuild yourself from the inside out. These are the moments when the soul grows without permission, and Weil believed that this growth is the closest most of us get to real transformation. She once wrote that focusing on suffering is like a door that opens to something greater, not because pain itself is sacred, but because it exposes the deepest longing of the human heart. The longing to understand why we exist, why we love, why we break, why we continue. And this longing intensifies when everything else fades away, just as a candle shines brighter in a dark room. The soul becomes more visible in suffering than in any moment of tranquility. There is also a silent curiosity in the experience of pain, a curiosity that raises questions you never thought you would, such as, who am I when everything familiar is taken from me? Or what remains of me when all the roles I've played begin to dissolve? Or why do wounds I thought I had forgotten return precisely when I feel most alone? These questions carry a weight that ordinary life rarely allows us to explore, and yet suffering places them at the center of your mind, demanding that you answer them honestly. We'll believe that facing these issues without running away is an act of immense courage. She said that the soul becomes more aware of its fragilities, more honest, more awake, and even if suffering seems like a collapse, it often reveals a foundation you didn't even know you still possessed. That's why people sometimes look back at their darkest periods and say, without pride, but with a sincere whisper, that it transformed them in ways nothing else ever could. Because pain has the power to reveal the part of you that was waiting to be seen. And if you've ever experienced this, if you've ever felt that strange awakening that happens when something inside you opens up, share it in the comments. Your story might be the reflection someone needs to recognize their own truth. And if these words resonate deeply with you, consider subscribing. It helps me continue creating a space where we can explore what life reveals only in its most honest moments. There comes a point in life when your body starts speaking a language you never agreed to learn, a language of limits, aches, pauses, and small hesitations that didn't exist before. And at first, you tell yourself it's temporary, that the morning stiffness will pass, that the slower steps are just the result of a long day, that the shortness of breath halfway up the stairs is just because you rushed. But slowly and silently, undeniably, your body begins to reveal its age in ways that no amount of willpower can overcome. And yet, inside you there is something that refuses to age, something that still burns with a flame that seems almost out of place in the life you are living now. It is a strange contradiction to wake up in a body that feels heavier, more fragile, more deliberate, while carrying a soul that still runs at the speed of moments when you felt unstoppable. This inner flame refuses to keep pace with the calendar, and there is something beautiful and painfully ironic in this discrepancy. Perhaps you realize this one day while passing in front of a mirror and seeing someone older than the person you feel you are inside, and for a second you stopped, not out of vanity, but out of confusion, wondering how the world sees you one way while you still feel another. A secret youth that persists beneath the surface, refusing to be extinguished even when the world no longer reflects it. There are memories from years ago that remain vivid as if they happened yesterday. The way you moved without thinking, how your hands felt stronger, how you laughed with your whole body, how the nights seemed longer and the mornings brighter. These memories carry a kind of muscle memory that the body can no longer reproduce, and this creates a tension that is rarely expressed. A silent sadness that arises when you realize that the body you now inhabit cannot fully express the intensity that still pulsates within you. Sometimes it happens in simple ways, like when you bend down to pick something up and your knees remind you of every year you've lived, or when you reach for a shelf and feel a slow ache run down your shoulder, or when you sit and stay seated longer than you intended, because the idea of getting up requires a little more thought than before. These little moments accumulate and form a truth that no one teaches us to accept. But while the body contracts, the soul expands, while the skin softens, the heart deepens, while the muscles weaken, the inner life becomes stronger, richer, more conscious. This is the paradox that Simone Weil understood with almost painful clarity. The weakening of the body often exposes the brilliance of what has always lived within us, a brilliance that youth and strength sometimes obscure, because when we are young, everything revolves around movement, achievements, and possibilities. But when we reach a certain point, life begins to turn towards meaning, depth, presence, and this change has a silent power. There is a profound awakening that occurs when you begin to understand that the aging of the body does not mean that the soul is diminishing. In fact, many people discover parts of themselves only when the physical world slows down enough for them to hear what the soul has been whispering for decades. The dreams they postponed, the emotions they buried, the truths they ran from. Everything comes to the surface, and suddenly, inner youth becomes stronger than it ever was in previous years. You may even feel that a younger version of yourself lives within you, still vibrant, still curious, still hopeful, but misunderstood by the reflection in the mirror. This can generate a loneliness that is difficult to explain, because the world often only sees what is visible and rarely perceives the fire that continues to burn beneath your aging skin. This fire is real. This fire is alive. This fire is part of you, something that time cannot touch, no matter how many birthdays have passed. And there is a strange courage in accepting this dual existence. The physical self that moves more slowly, and the inner self that still runs in search of meaning. Because this courage demands vulnerability. It demands admitting that you are not who you were, but neither are you who people assume you have become. It is the courage to uphold both truths simultaneously, without shame, without excuses, with a serene dignity that is only acquired through years of life and survival. On some days, the contrast between body and soul becomes almost poetic, like when you sit by the window and watch the world outside moving faster than you can keep up with. But inside, you feel a serene wisdom telling you that you no longer need to keep pace as before. Or when you hear a song from your youth and your heart responds instantly, even if your body remains still. These moments reveal a deeper reality. The soul has its own time, its own rhythm, its own thirst for meaning. And this hunger is part of what keeps you alive, not just physically, but also spiritually, emotionally awake, spiritually aware. It's the reason you still feel things deeply, the reason memories still move you, the reason beauty still reaches you, the reason loss still shatters you, the reason love still touches you in places no one else sees. This hunger refuses to age, even as the body ages, and perhaps that is the truest sign that something eternal lives within you. If you feel this tension between an aging body and a soul that still burns, share some of your experience in the comments. Your words may remind someone that they are not alone living between these two worlds. And if these reflections resonate with a hidden part of you, consider subscribing so we can continue exploring these truths that the heart recognizes long before the world. There is a silent mistake that almost everyone makes without realizing it. A mistake so gentle and subtle that it becomes part of the rhythm of life, seeping into our days like dust accumulating on forgotten shelves. Not suddenly, but slowly and patiently, invisibly. And when we realize it, something essential within us has already changed in ways we never imagined. This mistake begins with the small habit of distancing ourselves from ourselves. It happens whenever we choose distraction instead of reflection, whenever we fill the silence with noise, whenever we ignore an uncomfortable feeling because we are too tired, too busy, or too afraid to examine its true meaning. And so, the inner world that once seemed alive and vibrant slowly becomes a distant landscape that we rarely visit. This happens in such mundane moments that you don't realize their importance, like when you tell yourself you'll deal with grief later, or when you postpone a difficult conversation for fear of what it might reveal, or when you pretend to be okay, even though something inside you is silently trembling out of your field of vision. These small avoidances blend into an entire way of life, and without you realizing it, begin to distance you from the truth of who you are. For years, you may have believed you were doing the right thing, trying to stay strong, trying to move forward, trying to avoid becoming overwhelmed, because many of us have learned that strength means endurance, silence, resilience, keeping composure, even when our hearts are breaking inside. And so the mistake continues to take root within you until you can no longer tell where it began. Simone Weil believed that one of the greatest human mistakes is living on the surface of one's life, abandoning its depths. She often spoke of the danger of allowing the soul to become estranged from itself, because when you stop listening to your inner world, you don't avoid suffering, you only postpone it, and when it returns, it comes heavier, more complex, more intricate, with everything you tried to ignore. You can recognize this mistake in your own history by recalling periods in your life when you said yes when you wanted to say no, or remained silent when everything inside you begged to express itself, or stayed in situations that slowly extinguished your spirit because you believed that leaving would cause more harm than staying. These decisions made in the name of peace often result in an internal conflict that lasts much longer than any external conflict. This mistake also manifests itself in the way you dedicate your energy to everyone else without remembering to reserve some for yourself. You support others, listen to their pain, are there when they need you, but when it comes to your own emotional wounds, you whisper to yourself that it's not the right time, that you'll face it tomorrow, next week, or someday, and that someday turns into years, and years turn into a lifetime dedicated to survival instead of life. There's an old psychological idea that people rarely talk about. The human mind becomes adept at avoiding the very truths that would set it free, because facing them is like being in an empty room, without protection, without excuses, without distractions. This kind of vulnerability terrifies us, but the cost of avoiding it is much greater, because each truth buried within us becomes a weight we silently carry over the years. Perhaps you remember a decision made decades ago, one that still comes to mind, a path you didn't take, a chance you denied yourself because fear whispered louder than desire, or a moment when you allowed someone to diminish your spirit because you believed that person's comfort mattered more than your own. And perhaps you thought time would erase those moments, but instead, they return in your quiet moments, demanding the attention you never gave them. And the most painful part is that this mistake often makes people believe they have failed in life, when in reality, they simply forgot to take care of themselves with the same dedication they dedicate to the world around them. You can look at your past and see only the moments when you remained silent, the moments when you settled, the moments when you ignored your needs. But what you rarely see is the strength needed to survive those moments, even when making the wrong choices. There is something incredibly human about discovering this mistake later in life, when the noise begins to fade and distractions lose their power, and suddenly you hear the faint echo of your own soul calling you back, because even after years of neglect, the inner self never disappears. It waits in the recesses of memory, in the weight of regret, in the indefinable longing, in the hope that one day you will return. And the moment you finally turn inward, even with fear, even with confusion, even with the discomfort of facing what you previously avoided, something begins to change silently, profoundly, inevitably. Because truth doesn't demand perfection, only honesty, and the soul you abandoned for so long resurfaces, not with anger, but with relief, finally being seen, finally being recognized, finally being allowed to breathe within you. If any part of this sounds familiar, share a bit of your story in the comments. Your honesty might be the light someone needs. And if these reflections resonate with your inner world, consider subscribing. It helps keep this space active for conversations most people have forgotten how to have. There comes a moment in almost all of our lives when the silence of the divine becomes heavier than any pain we have ever carried. A silence so vast and so still that it feels as if heaven itself has turned its back on us. And in this silent pain, we begin to ask questions that we previously feared to express aloud. Questions like, why does nothing answer when I call? Or why does my suffering echo in the void? Or why do I feel abandoned by something I was taught would never abandon me? This silence is not like the silence of an empty room. It is deeper, more intimate, more unsettling. It arrives when you kneel in the privacy of your thoughts and feel nothing in return. When you whisper your fears into the night and the darkness remains unchanged, when you search for meaning and your hand closes in midair. And the worst part is not the silence itself, but the uncertainty it awakens within you. The silent suspicion that you are speaking to a universe that has forgotten your name. Simone Weil understood this silence with a clarity that most people would never dare to face. She lived much of her life believing that the absence of a response was not a punishment, but a test of the soul, a refinement of attention, a stripping away of illusions, so that only the purest longing remained. She wrote that the divine withdraws not to torment us, but to create space for a deeper encounter, an encounter that cannot happen when comfort and certainty fill every corner of the heart. According to Weil, divine silence is like a candle placed far away in a dark corridor. It compels us to walk slowly, carefully, and attentively, to approach it not with impatience, but with a kind of trembling sincerity, because if the light were closer, we would run. If it were brighter, we would not seek it. If it were certain, we would not question anything. And without questioning, the soul cannot develop and become what it is destined to be. There is an experience that many people go through, but rarely talk about. The moment when prayer becomes a whisper that seems to dissipate before reaching anything beyond one's own breath. When you sit alone with your worries and, instead of feeling comforted, you feel suspended, weightless, adrift between hope and resignation. and you begin to wonder if the silence you hear is, in fact, the sound of an answer you don't yet understand. Think of the moments in your life when everything seemed to be falling apart, when you pleaded for clarity, relief, or guidance, and yet nothing changed. No sign, no message, no transformation in the world around you, just relentless stillness. And yet, strangely, you survived. And even stranger still, something within you transformed, perhaps slowly, perhaps painfully, but undeniably. And this transformation didn't come from what you received, but from what you endured. Weil believed that this silence is the place where the soul expands into its fullest dimension. She said that true spiritual growth doesn't happen when we are comforted, but rather when we are stripped of all false certainty, all borrowed beliefs, all easy answers. Because only then can we discover what remains when nothing else sustains us. Silence becomes a mirror, showing us who we are without disguises, without scripts, without the expectations of others. This can be frightening because silence forces you to turn inward, to the parts of yourself you most avoid. It reveals your doubts, your fears, your longing, your emptiness, your yearning for a connection that goes beyond human presence. And in facing these truths, you become aware of how fragile you are, and yet how resilient you have been despite everything. Sometimes, silence arrives not as emptiness, but as a pause, a strange stillness that unexpectedly interrupts your daily life. You might be washing dishes, stuck in traffic, or folding laundry, when suddenly a feeling of distance envelops you, as if the world has receded slightly, and for an instant, nothing seems solid, nothing seems predictable, and you feel that something vast and nameless is watching you from a distance, not with cruelty, but with unfathomable patience. There are countless people who describe moments when they felt abandoned by what they believed guided them, and yet, years later, they look back and realize that it was precisely those moments that shaped them, the moments that deepened their compassion, sharpened their awareness, softened their judgments, and forced them to build an inner life strong enough to withstand the storms they once feared. This is the paradox of divine silence. It wounds, but it also expands. It breaks, but it also strengthens. Will believed that the divine hides itself not to leave us alone, but to allow the soul the freedom to choose its own path. Because forced proximity is not intimacy, and unquestioning faith is not depth. She said that the divine is like a presence that withdraws, so that the soul can move forward, so that longing becomes sincere, so that desire becomes conscious, so that the quest becomes real and not inherited from others. And if you find yourself in a period of silence, where nothing responds, where nothing moves, where the sky seems closed and the world seems dark, know that you are not failing, you are not being punished, you have not been forgotten. You are in the very space where the soul is shaped, the space where longing sharpens into clarity, where humility becomes strength, where the heart learns to see in the darkness. If these reflections touch on something you've felt in your most intimate moments, share a little in the comments. Your words may comfort someone who is afraid to admit their own silence. And if these thoughts resonate with your journey, consider subscribing. This helps keep this space active so we can continue exploring the truths that most people whisper to themselves in the darkness. There is a truth that frightens almost everyone who finally hears it. A truth that resides at the heart of human experience, like a silent flame that no one wants to get too close to, because instinct tells us it will burn, no matter how delicately we touch it. The truth is simple and devastating. You cannot escape pain. And more than that, you should never have escaped it completely, because every attempt to flee from it only makes it return in another form, stronger, sharper, more demanding than before. For most of your life, you may have subtly learned that your goal was to avoid suffering, to protect yourself from discomfort, to build a life that kept you safe, stable, and untouched by anything too burdensome. But the deeper reality, the one most people hope never to face, is that avoiding suffering doesn't protect you. On the contrary, it weakens you, exhausts you, and shapes your life in ways far more painful than the original wounds ever could. This truth becomes evident when you recall moments when you distanced yourself from something you deeply desired for fear of getting hurt, or when you remained silent in relationships to avoid conflict, or when you stayed in situations that slowly eroded your spirit because change seemed more frightening than the persistent pain. And only years later sometimes do you realize that the fear of pain caused more damage than the pain itself would have caused. Simone Weil understood this with a clarity that shatters all comforting illusions. She believed that suffering, when confronted with attention instead of avoidance, has the power to reveal a person to themselves, not because pain is noble or beautiful, but because it leaves no room for lies. When something inside you breaks, even the slightest, your entire inner world becomes visible. The truth emerges to the surface like something pulled upwards by gravity, and suddenly, you can no longer pretend that you are okay, that you haven't changed, or that you remain untouched. There's a moment many people experience, but rarely admit to. The moment you realize you've spent decades protecting yourself from the wrong things, trying to shield yourself from pain, but allowing yourself to shrink, avoiding romantic disappointments, but accepting loneliness, avoiding risks, but letting your dreams die silently inside you, one by one. And when the truth finally settles into your life, the feeling is one of unbearable weight, and at the same time, strangely liberating. Liberation comes from the awareness that you can stop running away, you can stop demonstrating strength, you can stop pretending that being untouched is the same as being whole. You can stop confusing avoiding pain with living wisely, because they are not the same thing. And deep down, you always knew that the experiences that shaped you the most were the ones you would never have chosen. Think of the moments of loss you survived, the days you carried the pain like an unmoving stone, the nights you were sure you would break, and yet you didn't. Something else happened, something more silent, something unannounced. Your resilience expanded, your compassion broadened, your discernment softened, your heart became wiser, not through comfort, but through the difficult truths that pain forced you to see. People often imagine that growth comes through achievements, periods of calm, moments of clarity, but the human soul doesn't grow that way. It grows when something within it expands, when illusions crumble, when the heart is forced to detach itself from what no longer serves it, even if that detachment hurts. And that is the truth that frightens, but also liberates because, once understood, you no longer panic whenever something painful arises in your life. You begin to recognize it as part of the human condition, as part of your history, part of your evolution, even when it seems unbearable. There is also a strange tenderness within this truth, a tenderness that comes from understanding that suffering doesn't make you weak, but rather honest, authentic, and humble, and reconnects you with yourself. Many people spend years building identities around perfection, stability, and control, but pain silently dismantles these illusions and leaves only what is real, what matters, what can survive under pressure. Simone Weil believed that the soul becomes more transparent in suffering, not because suffering is desirable, but because it removes everything that is unnecessary, and in that removal, the essence of who you are becomes visible. You may not like what you see at first. You may feel exposed, vulnerable, but there is a profound dignity in that exposure because it reveals that you are human, that you are capable of breaking down, healing, breaking down again, and still finding a way to move forward. There's a specific moment when this truth fully enters your life. The moment you realize that pain doesn't destroy you, it reveals you, brings to the surface the parts of yourself that were waiting to be seen, the resilience you doubted, the courage you underestimated, the tenderness you tried to hide, the longing you tried to silence. And in this revelation, you begin to understand why avoiding pain keeps you trapped, while facing it sets you free. And perhaps the most terrifying truth of all is that the things you feared most are often the very things that make you feel alive again. The cracks you tried to hide become openings, the wounds you tried to forget become places where the light enters. The loneliness you tried to escape becomes a path back to yourself. The pain you avoided becomes a mirror that finally reveals the truth. And this realization changes everything silently, completely, and irreversibly. If any part of this truth resonates with you, reminding you of a time when suffering taught you more than comfort ever could, please share it in the comments. Your story might help someone find strength in their own truth. And if you'd like to continue exploring these deep, unspoken layers of the human heart, consider subscribing. This allows this space to remain a haven for those seeking honesty in a noisy world. In every inner journey, there is a moment that arrives silently, without warning. A moment so small that, at first, you might think it means nothing, but which carries the weight of a lifetime. This moment is the decision to stop running from yourself, the decision to turn inward instead of outward, the decision to remain present within your own wound long enough for it to reveal what it has been trying to tell you for years. It never arrives with fanfare, it doesn't shout, it doesn't demand, it doesn't make promises, it simply waits. And then, one day, in the middle of an ordinary hour, something changes inside you. Maybe you're sitting alone on the edge of your bed, maybe you're washing the dishes with tired hands, maybe you're contemplating the night sky through the window. Suddenly, a thought arises, unexpected but unmistakable. What if I stopped avoiding what hurts and finally listened? At first, the idea seems impossible because you've spent years building ways to escape the inner noise. You kept yourself busy, distracted yourself, tried to help others so you wouldn't have to help yourself, filled the silence with any sound you could find. But slowly, over time, the old strategies lost their power. The distractions dissipated, the noise diminished. The things that used to comfort you stopped working, and you realized that the truth you were trying to escape was simply waiting for you to stop. Simone Weil believed that the smallest inner decisions have the greatest spiritual weight. She wrote that transformation doesn't begin with dramatic gestures, but with a simple shift in focus, a willingness to embrace one's own suffering without shame, without denial, without the urgent desire to resolve it immediately. And that is one of the hardest things a human being can do, to sit with the pain and not turn away from it. You might remember a moment in your life when a silent decision changed everything. The moment you said to yourself, "I can't go on living like this," or "I need to stop pretending I'm okay," or "I deserve to feel alive again," even if you didn't know where to begin. These moments don't seem like great achievements to an outsider, but inside, they're like a door opening after years of being locked. And when that door opens, even just a little, the air around you begins to change. This inner decision often begins with honesty, the kind of honesty that doesn't flatter, that doesn't try to impress anyone, that makes you breathe a little deeper because you suddenly realize how much time has passed without telling the truth, not even to yourself. An honesty like, "I'm tired of carrying everything on my shoulders alone," or "I'm suffering in ways I can no longer hide," or "I've lost parts of myself that I want to rediscover." Sometimes, this decision arises in moments of exhaustion, when you've endured more than you believed you were capable of, and something inside you says softly, not angrily, but with absolute clarity, enough of abandoning yourself, enough of extinguishing your own light, enough of pretending not to feel what you feel. This simple recognition becomes the first step towards healing, a step so subtle that no one else sees it, but you feel it like a pulse awakening in your chest. Other times, it arrives with an unexpected tenderness, like when a memory surfaces and reminds you of who you were before life hardened you, or when someone shows you unexpected kindness, and it deeply moves you because you realize how long it's been since you received something kind, or when you feel a sudden wave of longing to reconnect with the world, with yourself, with something bigger than the small life to which you have been confined. This decision has nothing to do with strength, nor with heroism, nor with suddenly becoming someone completely new. It's simply about sincerely turning your attention inward and saying, "I am here with myself now, and I am willing to stay." And when you make that choice, something subtle changes within you. The fear lessens a little, the weight becomes a little more bearable, the feeling of emptiness begins to soften. Simone Weil believed that this kind of inner transformation allows grace to penetrate the soul not as a reward, but as a natural response to honesty. She wrote that grace flows not toward perfection, but toward openness, and in that openness, the slightest movement becomes powerful. It is the difference between a closed window and a window open enough for air to pass through. The world remains the same, but your experience of it changes profoundly. You may even feel that this decision reconnects you with a version of yourself you thought had long since disappeared. The part of you that once believed life could still surprise you. The part that felt wonder. The part that felt alive. The part that trusted in something greater than fear. And when that part of you awakens again, it brings with it a quiet sense of direction, not a plan, not certainty, but an inner compass that gently guides you toward your own truth. And as this movement begins, you notice things you've never seen before. You realize how your heart reacts when something is wrong, how your body tenses when you ignore its needs, how your mind calms when you allow yourself to feel what you feel. And these small recognitions begin to change your daily life in subtle but undeniable ways. the kind of change that is built not by force, but by awareness. If this resonates with something within you, if you've ever felt a quiet inner shift waiting to be acknowledged, please share your experience in the comments. Your words might remind someone that their small decisions matter more than they realize. And if this space feels like a place where your inner life can breathe, consider subscribing. It helps me continue creating these moments of reflection where your soul can finally express itself without fear. There comes a moment near the end of every inner journey when words begin to lose their form and the soul begins to speak in a language quieter than breath, a language made not of explanations, but of presence. And in this final stretch, something within you softens, not because everything is resolved, not because everything is understood, but because, for the first time in a long time, you are no longer fighting against yourself. This final movement feels less like a response and more like a calming, a gentle release from everything you've carried for years, the regrets that followed you like shadows, the loneliness that echoed in the corners of your days, the fears you tried to silence, the longing you didn't dare name. And, as all of this slowly dissolves within you, a sense of liberation emerges, a surrender that doesn't feel like defeat, but rather like finally putting your hands on the ground after standing for too long. It's strange how the most profound transformation arrives without fanfare, without light breaking through the sky, without a triumphant moment to declare your healing. Instead, it arrives silently, in the breath, in the fragile awareness that you have learned to connect with yourself in your purest form, and not to distance yourself. You have learned to accompany your own heart through the darkness, the doubt, the longing, the wounds that were never fully acknowledged before. And this companionship, the companionship of your own soul, is perhaps the most silent and magnificent victory. There comes a moment now when you feel the weight of everything you've lived through, not as a burden, but as something sacred, something that shaped you with careful and painful precision, something that sculpted depths within you that would never have existed without experiences that once seemed impossible to survive. And in that moment of recognition, the past doesn't disappear, but it loses its ability to crush you. You can face it without hesitation. You can take a deep breath. You can allow it to be part of your story without letting it become your prison. For many, this final stage of the journey is like sitting in a room filled with memories, each one glowing softly like a lantern suspended in the air, some cozy, some heavy, some almost unbearable to look at, but none of them demanding anything more from you. And as you walk among them, you realize that each chapter of your life asked for the same thing. Not perfection, not strength, not answers, but presence. A gentle, constant, and honest presence. Simone Weil believed that the purest form of love is attention. And in this final stillness, you understand what she meant. Because now you can finally give yourself that attention. Not the kind of attention that analyzes, judges, or tries to fix, but the kind that simply witnesses. The kind that allows every part of you to exist without needing to be corrected, hidden, or hardened. This is the kind of love that the soul recognizes immediately, even after years of deprivation of it. As this awareness settles within you, there is no rush, no urgency, nothing to accomplish, nothing to gain, only a silent gratitude that arises from a place within you that has been waiting for this moment, perhaps all your life. Gratitude not only for what was beautiful, but also for what broke you, because even the breaking brought you to this space of truth, clarity, gentleness, and depth. And now, as you breathe in this new stillness, you feel something more, something that is not loud, but unmistakably present, a small opening within you that resembles a wordless prayer, a prayer without request, without demand, without expectation, just a simple offering of your existence to the world as it is. A moment when you stop shaping life and allow life to shape you. A moment when you stop searching outside and allow meaning to find you where you are. If you close your eyes for a few seconds, you might feel the gentle change in the air around you, the tranquil calm within your chest, the serenity that arises from finally connecting with yourself. It's not dramatic, but it's profound. And as you remain in this final silence, you understand that nothing needs to be asked for, nothing needs to be taken, nothing needs to be changed. This is the kind of ending that resembles a beginning, a return, a reunion with home. And with that comes gratitude. Gratitude for the journey, gratitude for your courage, Gratitude for every part of you that survived what should have destroyed you. Gratitude simply for being here, listening, breathing, allowing yourself to feel again, even if it hurts, even if the healing is slow, even if it comes in fragments. Gratitude also for the invisible listeners and wanderers who walk this same path with you, even if you never meet them. Before we close this space, I want to express my deepest gratitude for allowing these words to accompany your inner world, for trusting this journey enough to explore the parts of yourself that many people spend their entire lives avoiding. Your presence here is significant and does not go unnoticed. It is an act of silent courage, and I feel honored that you have shared this moment with me. If this final reflection touched a sensitive point for you, feel free to share a thought or memory in the comments. Your voice may be the comfort someone needs right now. And if you wish to continue exploring these delicate and sincere corners of the soul, we invite you to subscribe so we can continue uncovering these silent truths together. And now, as you rest in this final breath of our journey, let the next steps come gently. Allow what has touched you to settle slowly, and when you are ready, when you feel the silent invitation within you, click on the next video that appears on your screen. It is waiting to walk with you a little further into the landscape of your own depth and light.